people may be able to pull the compliance report in their production environment and be able to show that they have a secure development lifecycle of how they're promoting code within an environment. Then you look in their development, or like you said, the shadow IT in the environment, the cloud shadow IT, and you look at it and, hey, we've got customer data out there in unsecured S3 buckets. Isn't that great? Absolutely. And then, how do you find out about it, right? Is it the security research that it tells you, or do you end up on bleeping computer because, you exposed, 64 million credit card numbers?
I'm Steve Stonebreaker, and this is Ephemeral Security.
I have with us today Jim Rigney. He has over 20 years of security experience. How you doing, Jim?
I'm doing well, Steve. Thanks for having me on the show.
Excellent. I'm glad to have you here. So when did you first use a computer?
So I first used a computer in the late 1980s. Thinking back, it was an IBM XT, and it was genuine, actually not a clone. And, I was immediately fascinated by the potential. That time, I got a 1200 baud Hayes integrated modem for Christmas, and was introduced to the world of bulletin board systems at the time. And I think we've talked about that over the years. Excited me about the potential of computers, and I think was foundational in getting me into networking and communications. And I've always had that interest.
What did you do on the BBS systems?
Yeah, I was mainly a consumer of it. I was a kid in the 80s, right? Wanted to play games, and fascinated with Games Magazine, and I taking those magazines, and they would actually have text files within the magazine too. You could type in and create your own basic games. But I was mainly to download shareware and freeware, and there was not a whole lot of DRM out there at that time, and talk basic ASCII games, people that you meet online, and exchange software. But yeah, that was mainly my interest as a young person.
I come from a time where they would have floppy disks in the magazines. I never had to type out the code.
The old 7.5-inch floppies. Sorry to interrupt you, right? And then we thought we were cool with double density 3.5-inch floppies.
Then the bulletin board systems, people would, I guess, have the programs already typed up, and you would just download them that way.
Yeah, absolutely. So the programs, were mainly at that time basic, and nothing was executed. In my formative years in school, I was lucky enough to attend a school that had the old trash 80s. You remember those that were basic, and was able to port a lot of that interest and knowledge into those games. And a lot of things were freeware and things like that. But of course, that was also the advent of computing at that time. I think, especially for young people, was games and talking with your friend. I think I took apart everything in my mother's house as a child to see what that is, and look through many editions of, all the forerunner of the quote unquote internet at that time was colleges and universities. And that's, if you wanted to read a Bell System technical journal, that's where you went to and learn about how integrated systems worked, and in-band and out-of-band signaling worked, and, what people were doing with various things. And obviously to drive that curiosity around, how you could exploit inefficiencies in everyday things to make them do things that weren't intended, right? So I think that's kind of how we all gained that curiosity and wanted to learn as formative years.
So the BBS was, I'm trying to think of almost like a set group of people on different BBS. I want to say BBS systems, but really BBS is a system, right? So a different bulletin boards, there'd be different groups of people, and then different threads, kind of like maybe if you think about Reddit, right? There's subreddits, right? So you have threads on the bulletin boards, right?
Different Usenets, right? And different, categories for what you're interested in at the time.
Oh, yeah. Speaking of Usenet, I'm not really sure that came around. Did that come around after BBS?
I think that was from the 60s. That was old Unix systems. I think those started in, I'd have to Google it, but I'm fairly sure that came out of Berkeley and AT&T back in the day, where folks would collaborate on various problems that they were working on for software engineering, or network engineering wasn't a thing. A lot of folks were running Banyan Vines, and they were running Unix and things like that. And if there was, you had a question on something you were trying to do, you'd put it out there. And how, the Linux kernel and other applications are maintained today in the GNU ecosystem, right? If If you had a question, you found a bug, you talked about it. Obviously, there was, non-software related threads on BBS. People talk about everything. It's the old bulletin board systems. If it's like a good analogy, like you said, is Reddit, right? There's a subreddit for everything under the sun. At that time, there was a different group for everything under the sun. And to your point, the BBS system certainly attracted, certain groups of people to different ones, right? At that time, you could actually, spin something up on your own. As long as you parents didn't mind that you were seizing the phone line constantly, you could certainly take advantage of it. You remember downloading ASCII images and waiting for it? I'm sure you do. Good times.
So you got an undergrad in political science. Does that help you to police science, right?
Police science. I did. Yeah. So at that time, I think it certainly provided me with a firm foundation in the principles of ethics and investigative technologies. The background's been valuable within information security, specifically around conducting investigations and maintaining a chain of evidence and working with a lawyer. I think that's definitely something you're not necessarily born with, right? You have to think about what are the elements of breach. And I think assisted me in applying inductive reasoning to figure out problems and working backwards. So I came up through networking and firewall and layer 1 through 4. And I think that it was invaluable in helping me be able to work backwards through a problem. So if something's not working and you have a given result, what are the potential ways that we got here and how should we look? That mindset, definitely helped me in my career.
My mind's kind of going a few different directions. Like, oh, how do we get here? It's like, the Chinese took over the firmware on the firewall. That's how we got here.
Huawei, right? That's why you don't want to, you got to watch your procurement life cycle, right? And maintain third-party risk and determine where you're getting this stuff. It's not just firewalls. It's telecommunications industry in general, right? How do we, we have to meet the supply chain, I think is a critical risk for us.
There's certainly a lot of stuff in the news. I think it's like Fortinet, right? A lot of their devices are getting taken over right now, right? You got to turn to botnets. That's been going on for decades, right?
Well, I think vulnerability management, right? Especially when you're talking about consumer level devices, and as I'm sure you see it in your line of work as well, with Internet of Things and how do we patch these? A lot of them, they're focused on connectivity rather than security, and that's where we have a lot of these problems, right? Probably the best way that we can deal with that is through awareness and making sure that patches when they are available and making sure that they're cognizant. The education I think is a strong way to combat that.
Yeah, definitely. And if you can get a home router, right, that is able to segment off the IoT devices, right, to their own network. Not a lot of consumer hardware can do those sorts of things, but
well, right. You also have to be cognizant these devices are a risk, right? Why do you think TVs are so cheap right now? Because they're looking at you as much as you're looking at them. I think very cognizant of the fact that there's an inherent risk in anything you're going to bring into your home like that.
Yeah, definitely. I think maybe there was like a bill passed or I'm not totally sure, but I read something about like the government's going to mandate that there's going to be some sort of rating on IoT devices. Like on the box, it'll say like basically like what like the hygiene is of this company or whatever. I could probably keep guessing. If I find the article, I'll put it in the show notes. But I think that's interesting if you could actually look at a device and have like an 8th ref rating on like how well does this company protect their IoT device, like, keep it updated, that kind of thing.
Well, I think the driver there is until ISO comes out with a standard consumer grade devices to say, okay, so what does that mean, right? It's like, what does 80 plus platinum mean, right? Think necessarily at the consumer level, a lot of folks understand what goes into that level of testing. And then what does that mean to you? Does that mean you don't need to pass a patch and do your appropriate due diligence, right? So yeah, okay, you have a sticker on the box, but what does that necessarily mean to you? I think we have to be careful in that regard because that certainly could engender a false sense of security within folks until there's the industry standards around what does that mean and how long these devices have to be supported.
Yeah, I definitely agree. You could have an A rating and you could still have a problem, right? It looks like the program is called Cyber Trustmark. It's getting launched by the Biden administration. Yeah, I can certainly see something with an A rating. It doesn't have multi-factor authentication. kind of like the whole Ring debacle, right? Where everyone's Ring devices started getting taken over because there was credential stuffing, that sort of thing. And then it's funny, everybody blamed Ring, and it's really the consumer's fault for not enabling two-factor.
Oh, 100%, right? It supports two-factor. It should be on.
Yeah, I am glad Microsoft's rolling out two-step authentication. It's not the best, right? Sending a text to somebody's phone, but if that's all you can do for like senior citizens or something like that, at least it's an extra step before the account gets compromised. So it's better than nothing.
I'll tell you what, Apple really does a good job alerting you to, regularly about permissions you may have granted, deprecating those permissions after a period of time if the app is unused and things like that. I think we can use that as a lesson, in the industry. There's a certain amount of due diligence that the manufacturer and the provider to the software has to bake in to be a market leader. And until, there's demand for that, people are willing to pay that premium for a device that, has that baked into their supply chain of development. I think that's potentially going to struggle.
You got the undergrad degree in police science. And at that time, did they have degrees in like computers?
My original intent was to, go into law enforcement. And, I dabbled in that. College. I was actually a federal correction officer around 9/11. And I went into, I started as a frame relay tester for AT&T, undergoing actually some contingency planning for a union contract that was expiring, which they ended up dealing with that, but we were all trained, and they started a customer network operations center, which was, customer facing, high touch. So I went into that. I was a frame relay tester, and then moved into, testing T1 circuits, fractional T1s, later on to cell relay at that time, which was frame relay, kind of moved into that. So, once, I was actually inside the phone company, I found my love for technology.
That's really interesting. So I don't know much at all about like maintaining or maybe what is frame relay? Maybe for people that don't know.
Well, so frame relay layer 2.5 protocols, they would talk about it, right? What would carry your layer 3 IP traffic at that time? So your layer 1 was, either a T1 or a fractional T1 or some type of dedicated lease line circuit, and you had your local exchange carrier. So we were long lines for AT&T, and, we would provide that service. So this is what rode over that T1, and then you would put whatever protocol you wanted over that for layer 3, whether that's either IP or IPX, XPX, or whatever, you were doing for your network, at that time. And mainly it was T1 at that time at 1.5 megabits was considered a high capacity circuit. So we dealt a lot with high frequency trading. We dealt a lot with, a lot of the banks, the financials. My group actually managed time in OC3, which is 155 megabits, was the Tonight Show circuit, right? Making sure that NBC could get that data from Burbank to New York in time for 11:30 and do their editing. Frame relay, essentially what it did is, you had these layer 2.5 cells, for lack of a better term. They're essentially packets that encapsulated the IP data or whatever you wanted to run over it for layer 3, within that, and it would transport it from A to B. And they would put, it was tagging, much like MPLS. They would put tags on these packets, and to make sure that, they were called DELCIs. What that would do is, basically say which traffic was yours within the network and where that needed to be routed to. So there was additional routing that happened above layer 3. And we would test physical connectivity. We would, quote unquote, latch a demarc, which means we could send a command that was in band signaling to loop up customer's router, and we could run a series of patterns to, stress that circuit and determine if there was a layer 1 problem, and then we'd troubleshoot, on layer 2.5, from the above the switching layer, to say what is actually, going on with that circuit, right? So if the circuit was good, if I could run to it, if I could run an appropriate pattern, then we'd start looking at the frame relay network. Now, later on, they went into cell relay, which became ATM, asynchronous transfer mode, which essentially was very similar, but they took 53 octet cells and fragmented the packets within that. And the driver there was, they would actually do packet stuffing to fill out packets that were unused, but it was faster because the devices didn't have to, inspect those packets, because they knew it was a fixed beginning and end. So that was faster than frame relay, and got a job with Verizon because they were as many of the other data carriers at that time, they were moving into CDPD data, and they needed a way to move, at that time, large amounts of data across their backbone. So it was all ATM, did a lot of troubleshooting for their retail stores in that environment. Was instrumental in working in their core, their ATM environment. So at that time was Cisco MGX 8850 and 8950 switches. Stayed there and worked with them, and as they transitioned into MPLS and were IP to the edge as 3G and then later 4G came out, deeply involved in networking there. And I left there as a distinguished member of technical staff in their network security division.
You came in doing network stuff, but then did you transition over to network security?
True. So I was very lucky in that I think a lot of people from my era and your era is that we were kind of born at the right time, right? So at that time it was only the voice knock. They only did voice, and they started doing CDPD data, which is cellular data packet data over the voice signaling, the unused channels for voice signaling, right? So when you fractionalize a T1 without getting too in the weeds, it's done several ways, but one of them is with Nyquist frequency. So they take a 1.5 megabit circuit and they fractionalize it into 24 64 kilobit channels. And if you're not using all those channels, you can obviously send data over them, and you can either do that over an air interface. So they sold packet data in 9.6 kilobit bandwidth at that time, and it was mainly for water meter signaling, the diodes that UPS would use for signatures, things like that. But a lot of it was public service telecommunications. So, that's when the computer-aided dispatch started coming out for police departments and things like that. And it became a big driver, Verizon and other telecommunications carriers to get into mobility and specific mobile data. So moved into, the data knock at that time and then into engineering. So we have OTN, which was the official telecom network for engineering, and the EDN, the engineering data network. So the OTN was what was customer facing, and voice, which became data, and we would manage that to the edge for the MITSOs, which are the mobile telephone switching offices, and they began to sell data. So then obviously once you have packetized data in your network, now you have a need for firewalls, you need to control bandwidth, you need to start looking at the security of your own devices, right? At that time when I first started, with CDPD, they everybody had a public IP. Our computers had public IPs. There was NAT didn't even exist. Now I was able to move in the company and learn more about data. So I think I was very lucky to come in at a very foundational time.
There's a few things that I want to pull the thread on here. One of the first things that I was thinking about was over provisioning. You're talking about like using these fractions of lines and stuff. Did you ever see any over provisioning happen?
Oh, absolutely, right. You see that still today. Like 5G, a lot of it is reused, 4G channels, and they bond the channels. I think there's a significant amount of, over provisioning, and I think they're often good, but often not good at determining what is the specific density that's required. Data by its very nature is bursty, right? So you're going to say that obviously burst up to 50% of your port speed or whatever that looks like. But yeah, absolutely, they over provision circuit.
Right. That's why some businesses pay the extra money to get their own dedicated lines, right? Their dedicated uplinks. This is interesting that you said that everyone had a public IP address. Then the carriers and stuff, the internet providers, they're like, oh, we need firewalls and stuff. And I guess can you talk a little bit more about like the inception of that?
I remember working at Verizon and trying to work to find ways to manage bandwidth, and that was one of the roles that I held when I was in the telecom industry, was transport performance, specifically around data. I was focused more between not after the air interface, but from the mobile telephone switching office into the core, and then through the core, and looking at what that looks like. So, obviously, IPs ran out very quickly in the the early 2000s. And we had to start natting people, and there was a certain amount of just like we fractionalized data circuits, we then fractionalized IP addresses, right? So ephemeral ports and things like that, you could do a lot of redirection, and just because you have an IP doesn't mean you're necessarily using all the ports. A lot of that can be shared, or we can NAT you 1 to N, and we can have multiple private IPs within the core that face one public air interface. And we had to ramp up very quickly in terms of capacity planning and what that looked like perspective. We hit the max routes for BGP for, that were being routed through our network. And, that was, a huge deal, talking about, essentially we couldn't ingest the entire public internet that level. And, we had to work on what that looks like, and implementing internal BGP, so we're not basically routing the entire public network through internet through our core.
So were you doing data shaping as well, or?
teams that I worked on, did that. I was more involved in ultimate transport performance and troubleshooting issues, making sure there was enough capacity and working with, the folks that provisioned additional network resources to make sure that that capacity existed to support the edge devices. There's obviously a certain amount of various did a lot of the Riverhead steelheads and quality of service, at the routers, prioritizing obviously voice traffic, which at that time, when they moved to transcoder free operation, which is essentially SIP, the codecs at that time are not that great and very sensitive to jitter and phase. And remember, timing is everything, right? When you're talking about data or even voice, voice over data in the network. All right. So once they went to MPLS, your voice was riding over a dead data network. The phone companies at that point, I would say after 2010, everything was transcoder free. There was no such thing as analog anymore. That was converted to digital and was packetized voice. So there was certainly a lot of QoS and traffic shaping that occurred to make sure that codecs could fill in those gaps. So it wasn't horrible.
So during this transformation, right, going from everyone having public IP to having firewalls, I assume security came into play along the way. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I think what the biggest driver for implementing, what we now consider security gateways, within the network, they didn't necessarily want you to host your own services. So pretty much, if you bought internet at that point, you were getting, 80 and 443. You weren't getting all, the entire port range, right? That was the initial driver for firewalls and implementing, IDS and IPS in the network, was actually to control what was going on over the network. And if you recall at that time, the peer-to-peer networks were huge. You had LimeWire, you had Kazaa, you had Napster, and everything else. And that was really the driver to control capacity and add a choke point, was, where I think those gateways came into play. And then it moved into the security of these public networks, themselves, to make sure that they couldn't be, exploited, or at least it was more difficult to do so. We moved to, in-band signaling rather than out-of-band signaling. That was done, in the late 70s, early 80s, and, on these circuits. And remember, too, you have the SS7 network. You talk about, the Internet of Things and things that are not necessarily secured and accessible. The SS7 network is, goes back 50 years, right? So there's a significant amount of signaling that you want to segregate from your publicly accessible network, even as it transits the packet core. The signaling goes between the telecom carriers. You want to make sure that that's not necessarily accessible in band or from the public network.
Did you say the SS7 network?
Signaling Series 7. It's how telecommunications providers communicate, how the North American numbering plans and international numbering plans, how those switches know what database various numbers are in, and how these calls were routed through the voice network.
So is that analog?
So it's an international standard, right, for any public switch telephone networks. Probably late 60s, early 70s, that time before we had an all digital network. That that's certainly analog signaling.
So is it kind of similar to internet exchange points?
Well, I mean, I think my understanding of it, and I'm sure somebody will probably correct us when this goes out, signaling that provides the interoperability between untrusted networks, and you can operate over IP, but it enables the publicly switched telephone network to operate over legacy analog or POT systems and modern IP networking, and has its own control protocols as opposed to TCP or UDP, right? So it placed SS5, which was in-band signaling, which was, we talked a little bit about the advent of phone phreaking back in the day, which became a driver, right?
Oh, okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So you were talking about protecting, the core, and also making sure that end users weren't hosting stuff in 8443, but then, Napster came along, LimeWire, and there was a lot of peer-to-peer traffic. I don't know, I'm guessing at some points the DCMA takedowns, right? I assume the big record industry and movie industry complaining, but also just the saturation of the network, right, for all that traffic. Did you have to deal with any of that?
obviously, it was a legal driver, right? To your point, you get served with DCMA takedowns, or you get served corporate communications, comply with lawful intercept and CALIA, and things like that, right? So you had to be able to determine specifically, who had what IP at what time, what was being done with it. But, the driver in terms of, implementing, firewalls at layer 4, I think certainly was what IP looked like at the edge, and, what ports were allowed and what services were allowed to be used over them, obviously, right? You can encapsulate, at that time, remember, these were not application aware devices. They operated strictly on layer 4, and the driver was to, act as a choke point at the edge.
When you talk about lawful intercept, or let's say there is like a DCMA takedown, or they want to know who did what at what time, I'm curious, is this like full packet capture all the time, or is it like targeted packet capture, like the movies industry, like they know this IP did something and now you have to start like looking at the logs and metadata, or how does that look like?
We had the ability to packet capture at full line rate, but it would be targeted in that you had to have where you wanted to grab that with a network. So I would not say, we're going back 10, 15 years, that we would not be able to say that we can determine specifically everything that was, in the core at that time. Firewalls and various devices became application aware, and certainly now I would very sure there's SSL decryption happening, and those packets are inspected, and that certificate is replaced within the publicly switched data networks that are happening out there. Now, does that mean that they can TCP replay, or whatever a better nomenclature would be for it, for anyone at any given time? Certainly not. I mean, the data storage would be tremendous, but certainly they have the capability to capture line rate and isolate traffic between a given time if the need calls for it.
When you're talking about the decrypt stuff, it made me think, I forget which country it was, but like they had like a blue coat firewall or something, and like they were routing all the traffic through it, and they owned a CA or something, and Firefox revoked the search. You know what I'm talking about?
The stories with that, I don't necessarily want to blame that, but I mean, I'm certainly sure it was a less than intellectually free country of the world. But yeah, I certainly do remember that, the third-party certificates or SSL decryption.
Everything, let's just go back to a time where everything could be decrypted because you had the CA cert, right? Then along came certificate pending. So that made things a little bit tougher, because then it's like, well, if we want to access this service, we're just going to have to let it through or whatever.
Well, right. I mean, your perception is going to be that, whatever you're trying to do is not going to work, right? And I'm sure that there's technologies that exist where they can certainly replace that cert that, we're not privy to.
Yeah, if you think about like Pegasus malware, right? You're going to take over your phone, right? And then replace your Signal app and put their cert in there. And then all your traffic's being read, right? You're at Verizon. You started doing security stuff. Did you get involved with any SIM deployments?
When I was there, we ArcSight SIM that we had there. So I was actively engaged in deploying that SIM and architecting kind of the advent of signature-based detection and snort, and using ArcSight for these detections, specifically on the network, and not so, a lot of it was detection more than prevention at that point, but was Verizon, over the years has certainly became a leader in being able to capture a lot of that data and what's prevalent on the public internet, and what threats are out there. Publish their reports yearly on what's seen out there. And I think and that being Verizon Core, I was on the wireless side, which was at that time a company that was owned by Vodafone and Verizon. That became a lot more prevalent, monitoring public networks and determining specifically what are the threats out there, and identifying botnets and various signatures and hashes for potentially threatening variants out there of malware or whatever.
Yeah, when Snort came out, it's amazing. It's so cool with being able to detect certain signatures and stuff. When there is a really large, let's like botnet, right, or like known malicious domains, was any action taken?
Sinkholing, right? Protect the overall availability of the network and confidentiality of customer data. So the driver was to be able to defend specifically against that. But yeah, certainly, so there's been instances with large botnets and malicious bad actors where we would actually sinkhole in our external DNS, which was given to the customer, specific malicious domains. But it had to be significant, and often there was the direction of law enforcement.
I guess I want to talk a little bit about BGP, I guess attacks against BGP. Did you ever see anything nefarious?
Most common thing that happens with BGP is, obviously wrong ASNs or people advertising, networks don't necessarily belong to them. And that's the driver, right? So I think they've corrected, a lot of that with how these routes are advertised. I think folks, shot themselves in the foot a lot more often, on the internet, right? So, but, certainly I've seen, my share of routing loops and things getting, black hole because of incorrect route advertisements.
So then you learned a lot about security at Verizon. Were there any other big projects or deployments?
Deployment of MPLS in the core. And again, it's another layer 2.5 protocol, which kind of in line with, ATM and frame relay. So, how we were routing that was obviously a big seller. And I think worked a lot of the same way is, allowing customers, both on a wireline and wireless side to connect their on-prem private networks to the air interface. I think that was a significant driver getting into transcoder free operation and carrying voice over data.
Can you talk about that like after you left?
Sure, absolutely. So went into private consulting. I had some significant exposure to security in terms of IDS, IPS, firewalls. I always retained, I think, my hands-on keyboard, intellectual curiosity, desire to be actually implementing things for a significant portion of my career, and did some private consulting and then moved into leading practices for boutique consultancies. Did some work as a consultant for a company that later became a Fortune 4 healthcare provider. I did a lot around firewall and route switch for their environments, which had a lot of highly regulated and were in scope for PCI and specifically HIPAA. And in that space, there's a lot around what needs to be done from compliance perspective and providing audit evidence. So I learned a lot about regulation and moving into those industries. And so that's kind of the brief overview. I don't know how far you want me to dig into that.
Let's talk a little bit about regulation. I've found the more I progress in my career, I love GRC because they help me. They help me get my job done. If I need another team to do something, I can go get the policy and I can say, oh, if we want to continue to do business, we need to do this. And then they do it. Whereas I guess before I worked in more regulated environments, you'd have to beg and plead and, do anything you could to get another team to do something. What was your experience, Ben?
The fact that it's become so prevalent. And again, I think the driver there is managing risk and making sure that you're making good decisions around with the appropriate level of due diligence. But I think also too, we had to, as I said at the beginning of the conversation, I think standards had to be developed specifically around federal systems, governance and regulatory compliance. The big driver there, I think, was procurement and making sure that you're managing third-party risk from a contractual standpoint. So if you attain, certain levels of compliance certifications, it makes it very easy for third party to contract with you because, you've had this audited by, a neutral party and that you can demonstrate compliance. Oftentimes it's mile wide and inch deep, depending on what standard specifically you're looking at. And I think it's certainly, when you talked about policy, but not so much policy, but the standards that are under the policy that say specifically third party needs to comply with or what you need to do with your own organization. I think, that's tremendous. So someone that leads engineers to be able to point to a standard and say, this is how we do things. And I think also one of the best things about GRC is that, and, specifically security architecture or, network architecture is that, you have referenceable architecture and standards that you can say that I don't need, if this complies with this and I'm able to verify it, then I don't necessarily need to review your solution because it aligns with what our overall IT strategy is. So I think that's certainly valuable.
Can we talk about your worst day on the job?
My worst day was probably during a major crypto locker attack as a consultant. That day lasted 7 months, and dealing with that. So as we joked about it, it was often the yeah, hey, you guys wanted full disk encryption throughout the enterprise, and we delivered that for you. So I'd say that was probably my longest worst day. In terms of my best day, I'd probably say when a security framework that I helped develop was adopted company wide, and I took a lot of joy in something that actually have a marketable impact on key performance indicators for security and reduce risk, to the point where you stated the importance of GRC, and that's how we measure those metrics.
Can we talk a little bit about third-party risk? So, I mean, I know there's obviously there's the hardware risk. We're talking a little bit about Huawei and stuff, but I think it was like when Eternal Blue hit, right? The CISO comes down and they're like, hey, do we have this port open to any third party, right? Because you start wondering well, what's their security hygiene like, right? Maybe I shouldn't have these ports open with them, right? So,
well, I mean, certainly, I think that's a driver, right? But I mean, everything is driven, from a business perspective. I think in terms of, again, thinking like a lawyer and learning that in my undergraduate degree, I think kind of helped me be successful in security, right? So, obviously, you have a certain amount of operational risk that you assume anytime that you connect to a third party. You don't want your own business disrupted. You want to make sure that you have the appropriate controls around service level agreements and availability, and you're counting on a third party for a critical piece of your business. What do those SLAs look like? And you want to dive deeper into, okay, what are your RTOs and RPOs and disaster recovery plans? And, how is this specifically going to affect my business, right? So is that something how do you transfer that risk, contractually? How do you mitigate that risk? And potentially you have, a second vendor that, you can have as a backup to ensure business continuity. That you see that a lot in the financials and legal, regulatory, and compliance risk that you have to assess within your organization's compliance with your contractual agreements, and local legislation, specifically around privacy. That becomes a big part of it. And then, financial services, right? Healthcare, government, those business partners.
Well, let's talk about protecting the end users from themselves. What are some of the best ways that you found that the companies can do to help end users be protected from themselves?
I would think the best, things that you have, things you see and you don't see, right? So I think that's kind of a two-pronged approach. The first part of it is education, specifically around hardening the individual user against social engineering, targeted spear phishing attacks. If you want to say that what's the best way to protect users from themselves is turn off email, but seeing as that's not necessarily an appropriate business practice and probably wouldn't be accepted by the business, I think a lot of things that we can do behind the scenes, such as DMARC, DKIM, SPF, and making sure everything's aligned around email, and then prevention for specifically around executives against email spoofing, and make that stuff is validated, right? So you want to have a good, I think, data loss prevention program in place where you've identified what are your key assets, what's sensitive data, and you're detecting is that potentially encrypted in transit and at rest, and where's it moving and where's it at within the enterprise, right? So I think those are some things that are kind of foundational within a security program.
I certainly agree, and it can take years to implement some of that stuff for sure. Just getting your first taste of security at a company. So what are your thoughts about browser sandboxing, BYOD, virtual devices? I think there's even enterprise browsers now, right? Because a lot of times teams don't have visibility into the end user's browser that much.
It's a large question in a big field, right? So I think certainly right up there with email, the largest attack vector is browsing and drive-by attacks. I think you certainly want to manage from several perspectives the end user's browser in terms of, first, from a vulnerability management perspective, is that browser up to date? You want to be able to control that. You want to be able to control critical upgrading to SSL where available, critical in managing that browser. In terms of bring your own device, for as a security guy, if you're going to ask me, I think, I want to control the endpoint. I want to have my EDR tooling on it. I want to interrogate your endpoint before you connect to my critical assets. I want to make sure that you have the appropriate things in place that I can protect not only your PII, but what my critical assets are. And I want to make sure that I have the appropriate authentication and AAA that able to determine where my critical data is, specifically if it's on your device. I also want to be able to wipe that endpoint if it becomes lost, and the advanced EDR tooling gives us that stuff. But in terms of bring your own device, I mean, certainly there's a place for it.
I think one way I've heard it is security programs can be like at a crawl, walk, run phase. Have you been with companies where they're at a crawl phase and they eventually get to the walk run phase and kind of see them grow up?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I was in consulting, right? That's the whole point. The driver is often compliance or contractual obligations or legal regulatory, drivers that they need to achieve a certain standard, right? So, and often a lot of that is contracts and procurement, for example, right? So now we're applying FedRAMP 853 Rev 5 at the state level. We see a lot of that in terms of the companies need to achieve a certain level of certification to maintain, to be able to win new business and to be able to certify to a third party, in their risk management programs that, you have a certain level of organizational maturity. So how are you dealing with change in the environment? How are you dealing with, availability, the CIA triad, right? So how are you able to maintain confidentiality, integrity, and availability of that third-party data? Because you could potentially be in a position where your services are critical to that company.
I certainly agree that regulations are a lot of the reasons that companies will go from crawl, walk, run. But I think some of it's also lessons learned the hard way. And I guess I kind of want to talk about lessons learned the hard way, and also when you have seen things go wrong, right? Like deployments, architectural decisions, even business decisions, and the security team disagreed with it, and then the bad thing happened.
I've been involved certainly with the risk acceptance process and conversations with senior leadership about, we have, a strong desire to be able to identify customers and determine where they're coming from and what is their profile to us as a customer and how we can market advertising to them. And do we want to get involved with, for example, TikTok tracking pixels or Facebook or certainly like that? That is as a security perspective, and I'm sure you've been across the table in these conversations as well. You guys have to understand, once you're compiling a significant amount of data on customers that you're potentially going to leverage for your marketing, but you're using third-party providers that are potentially nation state notorious bad actors, or you're using third parties that you don't necessarily control what they do with that data afterwards. That represents an operational risk, that represents a legal, regulatory, and compliance risk, and you have to weigh that against what you're saying you're going to derive from top line revenue for this. You go that route because you could incur a significant reputational risk.
I mean, the pixel thing, yeah, it can be a real nightmare. You can have all your data going out the door with a pixel. So you definitely need an AppSec team involved, and they're going to spend a lot of time looking at those pixels.
Let's talk about the secure development lifecycle of software and doing SAST and DAST scanning. And specifically, can you tell me what your code is doing and where and why? And, what are your third-party integrations and where you're reusing code and where are you getting that from? And, when you're doing these pull requests, what does that look like? Is that a trusted repository? And how have you evaluated, where that's coming from? It's not just what you're developing yourself. It's the integrations that scare me.
It's amazing how many third-party repositories get pulled into many projects, right? And then they can have vulnerabilities going up the chain, right? The cloud environment, Kubernetes, containers, it's still applications running at the end of the day. With applications, they're less like homebrewed now, right? It's using so many different third-party packages that the attack surface is greater, I guess is what I'm saying, as opposed to just custom written code, which of course has vulnerabilities, right? But if you're running known packages and you're not keeping them updated, you're certainly going to get popped. And if you have like server-side request forgery and you're running an antiquated, let's say, AWS metadata service, then they're going to get your private keys and they'll take over your cloud, right? And if you're not aware of those things, and you're just say, oh yeah, we're just running the same version we've been running for years, right? It's a risk.
I want to talk about cloud. How are you managing compliance, within your environment, and do you have the appropriate subscriptions that align to your data classifications, and actually having a cloud strategy and how you're managing foundational services, then that environment I think is absolutely critical to, manage risk.
Having a cloud strategy, implementing it, but then the big thing, and I'm really big on this, is the compliance checks, right? Like, okay, we said that we're going to have NetFlow everywhere. Let's check it. Do we have NetFlow everywhere, right? Or do we just think we do?
How do you manage config drift? Having a tool like there's various things, for, Palo Alto, the former Redlock, and, how are you managing, with the cloud native, AWS, Azure, and GCP tooling to, maintain compliance and auditability?
Yeah, definitely. And one other thing I highly recommend. Don't believe you're actually looking at all the cloud accounts your company has. Go to finance, get the records, find out every account you actually have. Because there might be some account that some team spun up for whatever reason, and it has ports open that you don't want open.
A lot of abuse around the saying that, what's a proof of concept, and dev and QA environment, and, oh, it's non-production, so we can run with scissors over there, and what are we doing? And I think you're absolutely right, because that is absolutely prevalent. People may be able to pull the compliance report in their production environment and be able to show that they have a secure development lifecycle of how they're promoting code within an environment. Then you look in, their development, or like you said, the shadow IT in the environment, the cloud shadow IT. And, hey, we've got customer data out there in unsecured S3 buckets. Isn't that great? How do you find out about it, right? Is it the security research that it tells you, or do you end up on bleeping computer because, you exposed, 64 million credit card numbers?
So you've been doing a lot of consulting. I guess, can you tell me some lessons you had to learn the hard way over the years?
Going back to your point, right, that there needs to be a continuous cycle of defining what your controls are going to be, auditing against their controls, measuring your success, improvement, and reporting. What are you going to do within the next development cycle if you only have a limited amount of resources and time and money to be able to improve your overall posture? I certainly have in my career, and others have as well, is not doing the appropriate level of due diligence and trusting what is being presented to you, because you either don't have the ability to, or you don't have the knowledge. There's a skills gap in how do you validate, specifically what's going on in that environment. Understanding each new technology as it comes out, what risk that presents to the organization, right? And who has your data, and let's talk about identity and access management, and how you're managing identity, within the enterprise, and who's reviewing those logs, and who owns a specific identity, and they periodically reviewed, and what is the entitlements and things like that. Not assigning data owner or a business owner, or how you're managing that within the environment.
A lot of that's through no fault of your own. You might walk into an environment and there's 80 admins, or 200 admins or 300 admins, right? And you can bang the drum all day, and then something happens, and then, hey, we finally have a project.
I think where people can't identify, or organizations can't identify what are their critical assets, they don't have good configuration management or ITSM tools. They can't say what are the crown jewels in the environment, where is that data, how is it protected, and who can access that in terms of identity. I think that's foundational. And you still see that in 2023 in terms of there's a specific methodology around it, but I think a lot of it is you become complacent, and folks are focused on connectivity rather than security, and it all comes down to what do you do when someone's not looking and auditing against it? You may make the bad choice because you're overworked.
Can you tell me about one or two true positive malware incidents you responded to, if you're comfortable with that?
True. I told you about, NotPetya, right? So responded to unexpected encryption event, and it was, instrumental, I think, in working with, that company to secure, their outer bastion, environment, and, providing data to, the incident response firm that they hired, determine exactly what's the causality there, and how to, drive that. Quite frankly, I often, in my, experience when I was more hands-on keyboard, did not, get much above layer 4 in the OSA model. I was not, certainly, a developer, or response was mainly, implementing protective and detective controls from, a network layer, and later on, analyzing packets and intrusion detection and prevention, specifically on the wire, and, later on EDR tooling. So I would say that not Petya was the big one.
Speaking of network stuff, NetFlow is great. I think over the past 5 or 6 years, I learned about, I think it's called Bro IDS and then Corelight. Are you familiar with Corelight or Bro?
I've heard of it. I mean, no, I would not say I'm an expert in any way, shape, or form.
It's like NetFlow on steroids. It's really cool. Instead of just having like source, destination, port,
You're threat hunting through the kill chain, right? It's network evidence.
It's lots of metadata, right? So you might have 100 different metadata fields on a particular flow, right? You'll know what protocols were involved, that kind of stuff. It's So you're right. It makes threat hunting a lot easier. It also helps you zero in on what specific flows you want to be targeting or looking at.
Yeah, it sounds very interesting. I've done a lot around, I would say, kind of developing the security orchestration and response processes. And I think something else that's interesting, looking up Corelight now, that there's definitely a component around heuristics and behavioral analytics, incorporating, the various metadata you say for, potentially impossible travel, or is this an unknown endpoint? What does that look like? I think that's, certainly, things that we need to, these data points that we need to incorporate into our XDR, SIM, SOAR, platforms. But again, it's a maturity model, right? Can the organization, does it have that level of COVID maturity that they can take advantage of that from an incident response, alert triage, and threat hunting, perspective?
Are there any mentors that have had a big impact on your professional career?
I wouldn't say, I've certainly had, mentors that, have, given me, certain insight, both about the way that I've responded to challenges in my career, and given me, I think, a thirst for gaining, more knowledge and being inquisitive, and kind of, encouraging that, single someone out for that. But, I've certainly had, teachers in both undergrad and graduate school that really had a big impact on my career. And I think the big thing that I learned from them was to think strategically, embrace new challenges, and always continue to learn, and be curious, and determine how things work, and it kind of goes to the quote unquote, I hate to use the word, hacker mindset. What are inefficiencies in systems, and how can they potentially be exploited, and how can I prevent that?
Nice. Are there any particular books you found valuable in your career?
Yeah, I'm a nerd, right? So Art of Deception by Kevin Mitnick was great. I was a huge fan of Ghost in the Wires, same author, but it's more technical, and I think probably your audience would enjoy better. Hacking: The Art of Exploitation by John Erickson is excellent. Deviant Olaf, has written a lot of books about lock sport and practical lock picking, and kind of the physical red teaming stuff that I found interesting. Sandworm is a great book, speaking of not Petya and dealing with nation state actors, from a security perspective. I think those are all good books that your audience would enjoy.
Now we're going to move to the pick of the week. I'll go first. Mine is a movie. It is called The Artifice Girl. The description is, it's a team of special agents discover a revolutionary new computer program that baits and traps online predators. They team up with the troubled developer, and they soon find out that the AI is rapidly advancing beyond its original purpose. So this could possibly happen in a not too distant future. Great movie. I think you guys should check it out. So what's your pick of the week?
My pick of the week is, and it's not necessarily from this week, but it's something I discovered this week. So it from YouTube, Healthy Gamer GG, had a video talking about burnout and are you burned out and don't even know it? And this is something that's extremely prevalent. It goes into specifically, the Maslow burnout inventory, and it focuses specifically on how do people that are high performers and they really strive to do well with an organization, how are they go from being engaged to disengaged, and what does that look like, and how to mitigate those risks. And what I found that was, we're often extremely overextended, and one of the key indicators is that folks begin to feel ineffective and overextended, and a sense of fairness, or they don't feel that they've achieved the appropriate recognition and reward, results in exhaustion, cynicism, and a decline in professional efficacy. So I thought that was an extremely good insight on, how we can prevent that in cybersecurity by making sure that supporting each other, that we make sure that ethics as security professionals, you need to be in an organization where while you're accepting risks from the business, that you feel heard and you're supported when you call out risks, and that when business decisions are made that often are contrary to what we would feel as security professionals, that we talk about that and we understand that that's a business decision, and how those people need to be able to participate in those decisions with senior leadership. I thought that was a great video, and it's about an hour, but I would encourage folks to watch it and understand.
That sounds really interesting. I'll definitely check that out. I'll put a link to it in the show notes, and I definitely agree with a lot of stuff you're saying, especially if the business decisions are not in alignment with a lot of the security team things. But at the end of the day, your job is to work for the business, right? You give your recommendation. If they want to accept the risk, they accept the risk, and that's just how it is. Do you want to leave our listeners with any parting words of wisdom?
Was thinking about that, so I would say that I talked a little bit about what's had an impact on my professional career, and need to strive to be technical, to have a home lab, to test security tools and methodologies, and to learn, experiment, and stay updated on emerging trends. You really have to love being in this field, and again, it's often a calling. We're all, I think, very lucky to be able to deliver in this field. But if you're not still interested in learning, and you're not still interested in advancing your own internal learning for your own sake, then you need to do some self-reflection.
Is there anything else you want to share today?
That's all I have, sir. I appreciate your time, and thank you for having me on.
Awesome. Thank you for coming on the show. I appreciate it.
If you liked the episode today and would like to help support us, please hit subscribe, drop us a review, or share it with your friends. Thanks.